When the F4U Corsair first appeared on the horizon of the Pacific War, it looked less like a bird of prey and more like some ungainly experiment. Its long nose jutted forward awkwardly, its cockpit sat far back on the fuselage, and its bent gull wings gave it a silhouette unlike any fighter the world had seen. To the Japanese pilots who prided themselves on flying the sleek, nimble Zero, the Corsair looked clumsy, too heavy, too odd, and surely too vulnerable to withstand real combat. They laughed at it, nicknaming it the Flying Zippo, a cruel suggestion that any burst of enemy fire would turn this bulky machine into a lighter going up in flames. At that time in the war, Japanese confidence in their aircraft was absolute. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had already shredded American fighters like the F4F Wildcat in the early months of the conflict. With its superior agility, tight turning radius, and long range, the Zero seemed almost untouchable in the hands of veteran Japanese aviators. They viewed American aircraft as primitive, sluggish, and poorly designed compared to their own agile machines. To those Zero pilots, the introduction of the Corsair was just one more example of American overconfidence. A lumbering beast with too much power, too little grace, and no chance of surviving a duel in the skies. Even within the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, doubts lingered. Carrier landings exposed the Corsair's quirks. Pilots found it dangerously difficult to bring down onto the deck of an aircraft carrier. The long nose obstructed forward visibility, making approaches treacherous. Some landing accidents ended with shattered planes sliding across carrier decks or plunging into the sea. Ground crews grumbled about its complex maintenance needs, and some commanders quietly wondered if the Navy had backed the wrong machine. Skeptics claimed that the Corsair was better left on paper than on a battlefield. And so, the Flying Zippo label stuck. Japanese propaganda spread the idea that the Corsair was doomed from the start, that its bulky frame was more fuel tank than fighter, and that once it was hit, flames would consume it in seconds. They portrayed it as another American blunder, a weapon that looked fierce but would crumble the moment it faced true warriors of the sky. Yet behind the laughter and mockery, the Corsair was hiding a secret. Under its long cowling, the Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine churned with over 2,000 horsepower, more raw power than most Axis aircraft could dream of. That bent gull-wing design wasn't just a strange flourish. It allowed the huge propeller, the largest ever mounted on a single-engine fighter at the time, to clear the ground. The Corsair's speed on level flight would top 400 miles per hour, faster than anything the Japanese had yet encountered in the Pacific. It carried 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, more than enough to shred even the nimblest Zero. Still, all of that meant nothing until it was proven in combat. In those early days, the Corsair's story was one of ridicule and suspicion. For American pilots, it was a love-hate relationship. They admired its power, but they feared its dangerous landings. For Japanese aviators, it was a source of laughter. A burning coffin, they believed, would only make their job easier, but war has a way of silencing jokes. And as the Corsair began to take to the skies in the South Pacific, its reputation would transform. The very aircraft mocked as a fragile lighter would soon reveal itself to be something far more terrifying, a war machine that could not only match the Zero, but outfight it, outgun it, and ultimately crush it. The laughter of Japanese pilots would not last long. The true test of the F4U Corsair came in early 1943, when the Solomon Islands campaign dragged on with brutal intensity. The dense jungles and scattered atolls became a proving ground not only for infantry, but also for the machines of the air. It was here that the flying Zippo made its combat debut. For months, the Japanese had maintained air superiority with their trusty Zeros, diving fearlessly into combat against American Wildcats and Warhawks. They believed that their dominance would continue unchallenged. What they didn't realize was that the Corsair had been quietly waiting for its chance to show what it could do. The first dogfights were unlike anything the Zero pilots had anticipated. They dove into battle with their trademark confidence, swooping down in elegant arcs, certain they could outmaneuver the new American fighter as easily as they had its predecessors. But this time, something was different. The Corsair didn't bleed speed in a dive. Instead, it accelerated, screaming downward at over 500 miles per hour, faster than the Japanese pilots could even follow. When the Corsair pulled up, it climbed like a rocket, leaving the Zero struggling to keep pace. For the first time, Japanese aviators realized that they were not the hunters anymore. They were being hunted. The R-2800 engine at the heart of the Corsair gave it sheer brute force unmatched by any Japanese aircraft. In straight-line speed, it was nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the Zero. And when the Corsair's 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns opened up, the sky lit with streams of tracer fire that could tear an enemy plane apart in seconds. Zeros that had once danced gracefully around American fighters were now being shredded mid-turn, their fragile frames no match for the Corsair's firepower. The flying Zippo wasn't the aircraft catching fire, it was the enemy. Marine pilots quickly learned how to exploit the Corsair's strengths. Instead of turning tightly with the nimble Zeros, they fought in vertical maneuvers, diving, climbing, and rolling, always using their superior speed and ruggedness to dictate the battle. Time and again, Japanese pilots attempted the old tactics, lure the American into a tight turn, then cut them down. But each time the Corsair broke away, looped upward, and came screaming back with guns blazing. What the Japanese thought was clumsiness was, in truth, overwhelming power. In this crucible of combat, one name rose above the rest: Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington. At first glance, Boyington didn't fit the mold of a disciplined fighter ace. He was brash, rebellious, and loved to bend the rules. But in the cockpit of a Corsair, he was unstoppable. Leading the famed Black Sheep Squadron, Boyington turned the Corsair from a laughingstock into a symbol of fear. His squadron tore through Japanese formations with ruthless efficiency, proving that the Corsair wasn't just competitive, it was dominant. The Black Sheep became legends almost overnight. Boyington himself racked up kills at a pace that shocked both friend and foe. The Corsair's long nose and intimidating silhouette, once mocked, soon became the harbinger of death to any Zero caught in its sights. Japanese pilots who once laughed at the flying Zippo began whispering warnings, "Beware the bent-wing fighter," for it was unlike anything they had faced before. Reports spread quickly through Japanese units. Pilots described how Corsairs would dive in from high above, fire a blistering burst of machine gun fire, and then vanish just as quickly, climbing away before a Zero could even react. Survivors returned shaken, their confidence eroded. They had gone into battle expecting easy prey. Instead, they encountered a beast that hunted them on its own terms. The Solomon Islands became the graveyard of Japanese aerial arrogance. What began as a proving ground for the Corsair turned into a battlefield where the balance of power shifted. Each sortie proved the same point: the era of the Zero's dominance was ending. The flying Zippo had drawn first blood, and it was only the beginning. By the end of 1943, the Corsair's reputation had completely transformed. To American pilots, it was no longer a dangerous experiment, it was a war-winning machine. To the Japanese, it had become a nightmare. The laughter that once greeted its arrival had been replaced by something far more sobering: fear. By 1944, the mocking laughter that once followed the Corsair had vanished. What remained was a kind of nervous silence among Japanese aviators whenever its silhouette appeared in the sky. The war had shifted, and the bent-wing fighter that once struggled for acceptance was now at the very tip of America's spear. Campaign after campaign, Rabaul, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, saw the Corsair transform from a controversial experiment into an undisputed predator. At Rabaul, the Japanese fortress bristling with airfields and naval bases, Corsairs swarmed the skies in aggressive sweeps. Marine pilots dove through flak and smoke to hammer enemy airstrips, cutting down zero after zero before they could even take off. One pilot recalled strafing a line of parked aircraft, his 6 Brownings spitting fire into wings and cockpits, until the entire row of fighters was engulfed in explosions. Corsairs didn't just fight in the air, they dominated the battlefield below. With bombs slung under their wings, they ripped into shipping convoys and shore installations, leaving trails of burning oil slicks across the Pacific waters. By the time American forces reached the Philippines in late 1944, the Corsair's reputation was unshakable. Japanese pilots no longer approached with arrogance, they came in with desperation. Dogfights spiraled over Luzon and Leyte, where Zeros, once so graceful, now looked fragile against the Corsair's brutal firepower. In one engagement, a Marine Corsair was swarmed by 3 Zeros. The pilot throttled forward, dove hard, and in seconds lined up on the leader. His burst shredded the Zero in mid-air. The second came in from behind, bullets hammering the Corsair's fuselage, but the rugged American fighter refused to die. Instead, the Marine rolled over, climbed vertically, and in one breathtaking maneuver dropped down on the attacker's tail. A single squeeze of the trigger, and the second Zero disintegrated in flames. The third broke off, retreating, the fight already decided. Stories like this became common. Corsairs returned from sorties riddled with holes, oil leaking, fabric shredded, yet still able to land safely. Pilots trusted the machine with their lives because it could take punishment no Zero could survive. The Japanese were stunned by its resilience. They had been trained to believe that 1 or 2 well-placed hits would cripple an American fighter. Against the Corsair, it often took entire magazines, and even then the bent-wing brute clawed its way home. The statistics told the story plainly. By 1944, Corsair squadrons were posting kill ratios as high as 11-to-1. In other words, for every Corsair lost, 11 enemy aircraft went down in flames. Across the Pacific, Corsair pilots destroyed thousands of Japanese planes while suffering only a fraction of the losses. At Okinawa alone, Corsairs accounted for hundreds of kills during the grueling air battles that raged day after day. For Japanese flyers, survival meant avoiding the Corsair altogether, for to fight it head-on was suicide. And yet, despite the fear, some Japanese pilots still tried. Over Iwo Jima, a desperate Zero squadron charged headlong into a group of Marine Corsairs protecting the invasion fleet. The Americans broke formation, dove like hawks, and within minutes, the sky was littered with burning wreckage. Witnesses described Zeros erupting in fireballs, their thin skins torn apart by streams of .50 caliber fire. The Corsairs returned home scarred and battered, but intact, their pilots alive to fight again. The ultimate irony was clear. The aircraft mocked as a flying Zippo was not the one catching fire. It was the one lighting up its enemies. The joke had turned on the Japanese, and they knew it. What had begun as propaganda ridicule had become a bitter acknowledgement of American engineering. The Corsair was faster, tougher, and deadlier, and no amount of pilot skill or bravado could change that. By the spring of 1945, as kamikaze raids crashed against the American fleet at Okinawa, Corsairs met them head-on. They ripped through suicide planes before they could strike, saving countless lives and ships. Japanese pilots no longer mocked the bent-wing fighter. They feared it as a harbinger of death. Every sighting of its silhouette in the clouds meant another mission that might end in flames. The Corsair had entered the war under a cloud of doubt and derision. By the closing months of the Pacific Campaign, it had become a legend. And for the Japanese pilots who once laughed at it, the name Flying Zippo now carried no humor at all. It meant only destruction. When the last battles of the Pacific drew to a close, the bent-wing bird that had once been mocked across briefing rooms and propaganda posters stood as one of the most respected fighters in aviation history. The F4U Corsair had not only silenced its doubters, it had done so with numbers, with fear, and with an undeniable legacy. It was the first U.S. single-engine fighter capable of exceeding 400 miles per hour in level flight, a milestone that shocked even its own designers when the early test flights proved the calculations true. Speed was its calling card, but it was more than that. It was speed combined with resilience, firepower, and a presence that rewrote the rules of aerial combat in the Pacific. By war's end, the Corsair's kill tally was staggering. Across every theater in which it flew, the aircraft had racked up an extraordinary kill-to-loss ratio, sometimes as high as 11-to-1. Pilots who once complained of its quirks now swore by it, and squadrons clamored to fly it. Marines in particular adopted the Corsair as their signature warhorse. On island after island, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the sight of Corsairs streaking overhead became a symbol of survival for the men fighting below. They strafed enemy trenches, destroyed coastal guns, blasted convoys at sea, and still had the power to climb into the clouds and bring down Japanese fighters with ruthless efficiency. And the Corsair's story didn't end in 1945. While the Zero vanished with Japan's defeat, the Corsair endured. When war broke out again on the Korean peninsula in 1950, Corsairs returned to the fight, this time against jet aircraft. Though technologically outmatched by speedier Mi-GTKs, the Corsair found new purpose in ground attack, unleashing rockets and bombs against North Korean and Chinese positions. Its rugged design once again proved invaluable, shrugging off damage and bringing its pilots home from missions that should have ended in fireballs. To have served with distinction across two very different wars was a testament to its remarkable design. It is almost poetic to think that the very features once ridiculed, the long nose, the strange gull wings, the heavy frame, were what allowed the Corsair to excel. The gull wings made room for its massive propeller and powerful engine. The long nose concealed machinery that delivered unmatched horsepower, and the bulk that made it appear clumsy, in fact, gave it durability that pilots trusted with their lives. The enemy's first impression had been laughter. History's final judgment was reverence. There is a deeper lesson in the Corsair's story. Wars are full of weapons that promise glory but deliver disappointment, and others that slip quietly into service only to prove decisive. The Corsair belonged to the latter. Its tale is one of underestimation, a fighter laughed at by friend and foe alike until it showed what it could do in the crucible of combat. Japanese pilots who once chuckled at the flying Zippo name lived long enough to understand the irony. It was not the Corsair that went up in flames, but their own squadrons that burned beneath its guns. The final images of the Corsair in World War II are among the most cinematic of the entire conflict. Pacific airstrips shuddered as its engines roared, gull wings lifting into the sky, sunlight glinting off dark blue fuselages scarred from battle. Smoke from burning wrecks curled upward in the distance, the shattered remains of 0 fighters dotting the waters below. The Corsair, once doubted, once mocked, thundered off into history as the very symbol of American air power. Its legacy is clear. Appearances deceive. The ungainly fighter with the bent wings became a nightmare for the pilots who mocked it, and a legend for the men who flew it. The flying Zippo taught a lesson that resonates beyond aviation, that laughter and arrogance are short-lived when measured against raw ability and relentless will. By the time the war ended, the Corsair had burned away the ridicule, leaving only silence in its wake. Do you think the Corsair deserves to be remembered as the best fighter of World War II, or would you give that title to the P-51 Mustang? Or any other? Comment and tell us.